Georgia, 1852, on the Caldwell plantation, the air itself seemed trained to obey. Even the cicadas hushed when Master Henry raised his hand. Summer pressed heavy on the land, the kind of heat that drove men to thirst and women to faint, but it never softened Henry Caldwell's appetite for spectacle. That year, his cruelty found a stage, and Jacob, 24 years old, born on this soil, tall from the fields, but carrying an old wound in his hip from a runaway's lash, was chosen as the evening's entertainment. The house loomed over the red earth like a monument to arrogance. White columns, verandas wide enough to stage an opera, shutters painted the color of money. Inside, oil lamps glowed, and out on the porch, Henry arranged chairs for his neighbors, their wives in silk gowns, their children restless but taught to sit still when mastery was on display. The slaves who waited at the edges of the yard stood silent, bodies rigid, faces blank. They knew what was coming. Cruelty announced itself like thunder long before it broke. Henry snapped his fingers, and Jacob was dragged forward from the yard. Sweat clung to his skin, his shirt still damp from the fields. "Sing," Henry commanded, and the crowd leaned forward. Not hymns of deliverance, not the deep songs whispered in the quarters when the moon was hidden. Henry wanted a jig, a merry reel, a tune fit to rattle the guests with laughter. Jacob obeyed. His voice rose, strong but trembling at the edges, a melody of mockery spilling from a throat meant for prayer. The guests clapped along, their jeweled fingers tapping against the chairs, their voices cheering. But when his voice cracked on a high note, when pain in his hip twisted the sound into a falter, Henry's smile tightened. He raised his hand. "False note," he said, almost tenderly. Then the order. "Water." A servant appeared with a wooden bucket drawn from the well, cold enough to burn. Henry himself tipped it forward, and the porch boards shuddered with the splash. Water poured over Jacob, soaking him to the bone, plastering his shirt to his back. He shivered in the hot night, as if winter had clawed its way into his bones. The laughter came sharp and cruel, a chorus of delight from men who called themselves gentlemen, women who lifted kerchiefs to hide their smirks, children who learned that night that cruelty was amusement, that ownership meant the right to break a man like a toy. Then came the whip. Cole, the overseer, stepped forward with practiced rhythm. The leather hissed before it struck. Each lash meant not just for Jacob's back, but for the porch, for the air, for the memory of everyone watching. 10 lashes for a false note. 10 lashes for daring to be human in a world where humanity was forbidden. Jacob clenched his jaw. He would not sing again. Not tonight. He swallowed the cry, bit it into silence, and the silence itself angered Henry. "Make him sing louder," Henry ordered, and the whip fell again until blood mingled with the water that dripped from Jacob's shirt. Still Jacob did not sing. His silence, though broken, was the only weapon left to him. On Sunday the bell rang, calling every soul on the plantation to the chapel at the edge of the yard. The building was plain wood, painted white, its steeple sharp as a spear against the sky. Inside, the benches groaned under the weight of 2 congregations, the masters in the front, polished and perfumed, and the slaves in the back, heads bowed, eyes cast down. The preacher, a man sent from Augusta, climbed the pulpit and thundered against insolent slaves, quoting scripture as if chains were holy, as if obedience was salvation. Henry chose this moment for his lesson. He rose, dragging Jacob forward into the aisle. "This one," he declared, "thinks himself too proud for song, too proud for obedience." His voice carried across the chapel, and the congregation murmured approval. Jacob's legs were shoved from behind. He fell hard to his knees, the wooden floor biting bone. Cole stepped forward, his boots polished, his face unreadable. "Kiss them," Henry said. The command echoed like a sentence. Jacob hesitated. The pause was brief, no longer than a breath, but in the silence it grew immense. He knew the cost of refusal. His lips trembled, not from fear, but from fury buried so deep it nearly choked him. Henry's hand shut down, gripping his neck, pressing his head forward. Jacob's mouth touched the dust of Cole's boots. Laughter erupted. The sound was worse than the whip. Laughter rattling the walls of the chapel, laughter from men who prayed with the same lips that cursed. from women who nodded as if justice had been served, from children whose eyes glittered with cruel delight. Then the collar was brought forth. Iron, tall and spiked, meant not to restrain the body, but to humiliate the soul. They fastened it around Jacob's throat, the metal scraping his skin raw, the spikes rising high so he could neither lie down nor look aside. A bell fixed to it rattled with every movement, every step an announcement of shame. The congregation watched as if this were worship, as if humiliation itself could be sanctified. That night Jacob lay in the quarters, the collar digging into his jaw, his skin torn where iron met flesh. Every swallow brought pain. He could not rest, could not even tilt his head to the side. Around him, the others lay silent, listening to the rattle of the shame collar whenever he shifted. He was not the first to wear it, and he would not be the last, but that knowledge did not soften the weight. He remembered the porch, the cold water, the whip. He remembered the chapel, the laughter, the forced kiss. His back burned, his throat ached, and his pride bled invisibly into the night. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. The cicadas had banged their cry again, but to Jacob they sounded less like insects and more like voices, old voices whispering in the dark. He did not yet know what they were telling him, only that they did not laugh. They remembered. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Jacob moved through the fields, with the iron collar still biting into his skin, its cruel spikes forcing him to walk stiff and upright, as if the metal itself mocked his dignity. Every step made the bell rattle faintly, a sound designed to strip him of stealth, of privacy, of peace. Children in the quarters learned to flinch at the sound, as though shame itself walked among them. Even the men who labored beside Jacob turned their eyes away, for to look too long was to share the burden and risk punishment themselves. Mistress Emily saw him first from the veranda. She was young still, scarcely 25, with pale hands that had never known the weight of a plough or the sting of the lash. She lived in a gilded cage of her own, not iron but expectations, to bear heirs, to keep the big house shining, to smile beside her husband no matter how often Henry staggered home drunk with tobacco on his breath and cruelty in his eyes. Emily had no whip, no chain, but she was bound nonetheless. Perhaps that is why she noticed Jacob. One evening, when the fields had emptied and the overseer's lantern swung away into darkness, Jacob returned to the quarters limping, blood drying on the collar's edges. He had no bandages, only rags stiff with sweat and earth. Emily slipped out from the side door of the house, moving as if chased by her own heartbeat. In her hands she carried strips of cloth, a small jar of ointment, and a piece of bread hidden under her shawl. She found him behind the smokehouse, sitting on the ground with his back against the wall, breath shallow from pain. She did not speak at first. She only knelt and, with trembling fingers, lifted the edge of the iron to press a bandage against the raw flesh. Jacob flinched, but not from her touch, from disbelief. No mistress touched a slave except to command or to punish. Yet here was Emily, eyes lowered, hands gentle. "Don't speak," she whispered. "If he hears." Her words trailed into the dark, unfinished but understood. She pressed the bread into his hand, her skin brushing his. For a heartbeat too long, their eyes met. His were dark, heavy with years of endurance. Hers were pale, restless, hungry for something unnamed. Then she stood quickly, shawl drawn tight, and vanished back into the house. So began a ritual. At dusk, when Henry rode into town or drank himself senseless, Emily would steal moments in the shadows. A strip of cloth, a bit of food, a jar of salve borrowed from the cabinet. She never lingered long, but each time the silence between them grew heavier, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. The storm came in late autumn. Clouds swelled black over the horizon, lightning carving the sky in jagged lines. Rain lashed the fields until the soil became a mirror of mud and water. The slaves huddled in their quarters, but Jacob was ordered to the barn to secure the tools before the wind tore the doors open. He worked alone, the collar clanging against the rain, his hands numb as he fastened ropes and gathered ploughs. When the storm reached its height, Emily appeared. She slipped into the barn with her dress clinging to her frame, her hair loosed by the wind. She carried no excuse, no bundle of cloth this time. only herself. For a moment they stared at each other, the roar of the rain swallowing every sound but the thunder in their chests. "I couldn't stay inside," she said at last, her voice breaking like glass. "Not tonight, not with him." Jacob tried to look away, but the collar held his head rigid. She stepped closer, lifting her hand to touch the iron, to trace the cruel spikes as if she could remove them with her fingers alone. His breath caught. The barn seemed smaller, the storm outside forgotten. Her face tilted upward, her lips trembled with words unsaid. What passed between them was not spoken, for no language could hold it. In the shadows of the barn, between the smell of hay and wet earth, a forbidden closeness burned. It was not tenderness alone, but defiance, a fire born of two prisons touching. When she left, hours later, Jacob stood in the silence, his chest heaving, knowing nothing would ever be the same. Winter crept in. Emily grew pale. At first she blamed the cold, then the headaches that plagued her at dawn. But the months wore on, and her dresses no longer fit as they once had. She hid beneath shawls, kept to her chamber, turned her face away from the mirrors. A maidservant whispered of strange notes exchanged with the midwife, of small bottles carried in secret. Rumours slithered through the quarters. Mistress Emily was with child. Henry noticed. He noticed the pallor in her cheeks, the way she excused herself from supper, the whispered visits of the midwife. Suspicion grew in him like rot. He ordered daily searches of the slave quarters, his men tearing through pallets and baskets, overturning pots, demanding answers. Women were dragged out and interrogated, their arms bruised from his grip. None confessed, for none would speak Jacob's name, but fear spread like frost all the same. Jacob worked in silence, head bowed, heart pounding. He felt the storm gathering again, not of rain, but of wrath. He had no plan, no weapon, no escape. Only the memory of Emily's hand against the iron collar, the whisper of her breath in the barn, the secret that now swelled beneath her skin. And Henry was watching. Summer came heavy and unrelenting. The air itself seemed thick with suspicion, and on the Caldwell plantation, every rustle of leaves felt like a whisper against Jacob's back. Henry had grown restless, his temper sharpened by rumors that followed him like flies. Emily's pallor deepened, her steps slowed, and still Henry said nothing outright, not yet. But the silence was worse than shouting. It meant he was waiting for the right stage to unveil his wrath. That stage arrived in July at a picnic held beneath sprawling oaks near the riverbank. Neighboring planters gathered, their wives balancing parasols, their children darting between tables of roasted meats and jellied fruits. The Caldwell carriage rolled up late, Emily pale in her white dress, Jacob among the men ordered to haul baskets and pitchers. From the first, eyes followed her. Her waist, once narrow, had thickened. She smiled faintly, but the smile sat crooked, fragile as a cracked mirror. Henry kept his hand on her arm too tightly, as though steadying her body against collapse, or against flight. Music began, fiddles scraping out reels while the planters laughed and drank. Jacob stood near the shade, carrying trays as ordered, his iron collar replaced now with the heavy mask of silence, an iron contraption that covered his face with slits for breath, denying him even the small freedom of expression. It made him monstrous to the crowd, an object of ridicule. Children pointed, grown men smirked. Henry enjoyed their laughter, slapping Jacob's shoulder as though parading a captured beast. Then, in the middle of the laughter, Emily faltered. Her hand slipped from Henry's arm, her body swaying like a branch in sudden wind. She collapsed onto the grass, gasping. Ladies shrieked, men rushed forward. The midwife, called hastily, knelt beside her and lifted the hem of her dress to feel the pulse of life beneath. She murmured words, then raised her voice, unthinking. Her term is longer than her husband's trip to Savannah. The sentence cut through the crowd like a blade. Silence fell, the fiddles died mid-note, and then, from some corner, a whisper, "The child is not Mr. Caldwell's." It spread like fire, each guest passing it to the next. Faces turned, men stared at Henry, then at Jacob. Women clutched their parasols tighter, eyes darting. The unthinkable had been spoken aloud, and once loosed, it could not be caged again. Henry's face went white, then red. He shouted for Jacob, and in a moment the mask was forced over him fully, iron biting his cheeks, padlock clamped shut. The crowd watched, murmuring, some horrified, others savouring the scandal. A mistress bearing a slave's child, it was poison to their order, a shame to be burned away. That night Henry searched Emily's chambers himself. He found it in the drawer of her vanity. A locket, delicate, golden, containing a lock of hair. But it was not hers. It was not his. It was from a child, a mixed-race infant born on a neighbouring estate. To Henry it was proof, not only of betrayal, but of deliberate mockery. He crushed the locket in his fist, the metal cutting his palm, and stormed to the attic. Emily was dragged there, locked behind heavy beams. Water was withheld, food was rationed to scraps. Cole was ordered to force the truth. They brought cords, sticks, methods that left no marks upon the face but tore the spirit apart. Still Emily refused. She wept, she fainted, but she never spoke Jacob's name. Henry, drunk with rage, prowled the halls below. Servants shrank at his approach, guests had left in scandal, gossip carrying the tale across counties. He muttered of betrayal, of curses, of dishonour that could only be cleansed with blood. Jacob, shackled in the stables, listened through the iron mask as the wind carried Emily's faint cries from the attic window. The plantation no longer breathed with its usual rhythm. It held its breath, waiting for the storm to break, and Jacob knew the storm would break upon him. The yard was called together at dawn. Every man, woman, and child on the Caldwell plantation was driven from the quarters and forced to gather by the stables. Even white workers from neighbouring farms were summoned, overseers and tenants alike, to watch what Henry named the Court of Truth. A platform had been raised hastily in the night, rough boards nailed together, a stage for humiliation. Jacob was dragged forward in chains, the iron mask still strapped to his face. The summer sun struck the metal, turning it hot against his skin. His wrists bled where shackles bit too tightly. Cole, standing tall with his whip coiled at his side, addressed the crowd in the voice of a judge. This man stands accused of corruption, of insolence, of forgetting his place. The crowd shifted uneasily, yet no one dared move. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. The men from the fields kept their eyes low. Everyone knew the real charge had no name that could be spoken aloud. To say it was to destroy the lie that held their world together. Henry himself strode forward, red-eyed from drink, hair wild. He shoved Jacob to his knees before the crowd. "Confess," he roared, "confess that you defiled my house, that you poisoned my bloodline." The iron mask muffled Jacob's breath, but no words came. His silence was defiance. His silence was all he had left. The crowd murmured. The preacher muttered prayers. Cole raised the whip, and then a voice, frail but clear, broke through the heat. Emily. She appeared at the edge of the platform, dragged from the attic but still standing, her dress torn, her face hollow. She swayed as if every breath was borrowed, yet her voice carried. "The child is mine," she said, "my shame, my truth. Do not put his sins on Jacob." Gasps scattered through the crowd. Henry froze, then turned on her like a beast struck with a spear. His hand trembled as he pointed. "Shackles for my wife, whip for him, let them both remember their places." Emily was seized, her wrists bound, her body pulled down into the dust. Jacob was stretched across the platform, shirt ripped away, his back bared to the sky. Cole uncoiled the whip slowly, savouring the hush that fell over the yard. The first strike cracked like thunder. Jacob's body jerked, but he did not cry out. Another and another. The leather tore skin, raised welts, smeared blood. The crowd watched with the silence of the condemned. When the punishment ended, Jacob was left in the dust, scarcely able to move. Emily was dragged away to the attic once more, her voice hoarse, her body trembling. Henry spat on the ground and declared the trial finished. The crowd dispersed, but the memory clung like smoke in their lungs. That night, while the plantation slept under a moonless sky, a shadow moved at the edge of the quarters. Ruth, the cook, with her kerchief tied tight, crept toward the ditch that ran from the fields. Beside her was Sam, the groom, carrying a stolen key. They slipped into the stable, where Jacob lay half-conscious. "Time," Ruth whispered, her voice shaking. "If you stay, you die." Sam unlocked the chains, his hands steady despite the risk. They led Jacob into the irrigation ditch, crawling through mud and water, the iron mask left behind. Branches scraped his wounds, insects swarmed, but he did not stop. He had no strength left except for the thought of the attic, of Emily's broken body and her whispered plea. Through the night they crept, unseen beneath the stars, until the ditch curved back toward the house. Jacob left them there, against their protests. He could not flee without her. He slipped through shadows, past the sleeping dogs, into the house he had served all his life. The attic door groaned as he forced it open. Inside, Emily lay on the floor, too weak to rise. Her eyes lifted to his, and tears shone in the dark. "Not me," she begged. "The child. Save the child." He knelt, lifted her carefully, felt the bones through her skin. She clutched his shirt once, whispered something he could not hear. Then her arms fell limp. He carried her down the stairs, every creak a danger, every breath a prayer. Through the swamp they fled, guided by Sam's whispered directions. The air grew thick, the ground wet, mosquitoes humming like curses. At last, hidden among cypress and moss, they reached the cabin of Meg, the midwife of the maroon settlement. Smoke drifted faintly from her chimney, the only sign of life in the wilderness. Jacob laid Emily on the pallet inside. Meg's old hands moved quickly, preparing herbs, water, cloth. The child stirred within Emily still, fragile, insistent. Emily turned her face to Jacob, lips pale, and whispered one word: "Live." Then she closed her eyes. Outside, the swamp pulsed with unseen life. Jacob stood in the doorway, his body torn, his soul burning, and listened to the cry of a distant bird, sharp, mournful, endless. The storm had broken, but the reckoning was only beginning. Dawn brought no light to the Caldwell plantation. Instead, it brought a theater of cruelty. Henry ordered the yard assembled once more, men and women dragged from their quarters, overseers armed, neighbors summoned to witness. He called it justice. In truth, it was spectacle. Emily was brought forth first. She could barely walk, her wrists swollen from shackles, her hair tangled, her dress torn. They forced her onto the platform and tied her to a post. Henry addressed the crowd as though they were jurors. "Honor must be restored," he said, his voice trembling with rage. Then he gave the order. They whipped her, slowly, methodically, as though her flesh could erase the shame whispered across Georgia. Her cries split the air, then faltered, then ceased. Some turned away, others watched with satisfaction. Henry's eyes never left her. For him it was not punishment, but purification, an offering to pride. When she collapsed, barely conscious, he shouted Jacob's name. But Jacob was gone. That night Ruth and Sam guided him through the swamp again, farther this time, past the rice fields, past the roads watched by patrols. They hid him in a wagon bound for Augusta, his body covered with sacks of grain. From there, through hidden paths, sympathetic farmers, and the quiet courage of Quakers, Jacob was moved northward, state by state, each mile carrying him farther from the place where his life had been broken and remade. Weeks turned to months. He labored in secret barns, in kitchens, where abolitionists whispered prayers instead of orders. He learned to walk without fear of the bell, to eat without glancing over his shoulder. But the collar's memory never left him. Its iron still scraped his dreams. A year later, a letter found him. Smuggled through many hands, carried by faith more than paper, it came from Meg in the swamp settlement. Emily was dead. Her body, ravaged by wounds and neglect, had yielded to the grave. But the child had lived. A boy. He was baptized Noah. Jacob read the words again and again, until the ink blurred with tears he had long refused. Emily was gone, yet in Noah she remained, not as mistress or slave, but as mother, as defiance, as truth the Caldwell name could never erase. In northern parlors, abolitionists began to whisper of the Georgia scandal. A plantation mistress who bore a slave's child, who was tortured for her defiance, while the enslaved father vanished into freedom's shadows. Newspapers called it corruption, madness, sin. But in hidden circles, among those who remembered the crack of the whip, it was told differently. They said Jacob lived. They said one day he would stand before his son and speak his name not in chains, but in freedom. They said memory itself had fled the plantation with him, carrying a wound too deep to heal, a truth too sharp to bury. And so the scandal became legend, not of shame, but of survival.